So we're now going to walk through the implementation of the Zippy microservice, focusing particularly on its use of persistent mechanisms. And this will demonstrate how the Java persistence architecture can be integrated in with other aspects of Spring and Java. And as usual, you can get the code in the EX4 project in my WebMVC folder in my Live Lessons GitHub repository. So now we're back in the EX4 project. This time we're going to look at the Zippy microservice. So here's the Zippy application. A couple things to note here. You can see how it's a Spring Boot application, no surprise there. It has a component scan, tells it where to look for the various things it needs. And we also have an entity scan, which tells it to go over here and take a look at this particular quote class. So this is a quote class that's been annotated to work with the Java persistence architecture, once again showing the power of kind of declarative programming and annotations. So this class called quote is going to have some things generated automatically. It's also going to be marked as an entity, which means it can be stored in a database with the Java persistence architecture, and it's going to be named a table. The table it's going to be stored in is called quote. And you can see here we're going to have an ID, which is an integer, and a quote, which is a string. And the ID is going to be essentially the key, the primary key. And it's going to have a generated value, which will just keep incrementing every time we create one of these things, so we don't have to do that ourselves. And then the quote is going to be a column, which is the quote column. That's the name we use for it. And it's not going to be nullable, so you have to have a value for it. So that's what the quote object is here. And notice that when we're not doing the JPA stuff, this works just as a regular old class. So it's only when we use it for JPA where it's actually going to be used, where these annotations will actually be used in a sensible way. Then down here, we say, I want to have this particular repository be used as the JPA repository. So that's going to be the quote repository. We're going to look at that in a second. So ZippyApplication extends base application. That's really pretty much the same thing we saw before. But the difference is we've annotated this in a way that's quite different from the Handy application. Notice the Handy application didn't have all that annotations for using the Java persistence architecture. Let's go take a look at the ZippyController. That is just a base controller that's parameterized with a list of quotes as the return type. No real surprise there. And now let's come look at ZippyService. So we'll look at a couple things. First of all, you can see ZippyService extends base service, just like we did before. And it's auto-wired with the quote repository. So here is the quote repository. If we come over here into the common portion, you can see the quote repository. And as we saw before, this is annotated to be a repository, because that's what you need to tell it so that Spring knows it's a repository. And we're going to have it extend the JPA repository, where we have the ID being an integer and then the column being the quote. And then down here, we have this find by quote containing ignore case. And what's kind of interesting here is if I wanted to make other find methods, let's say I wanted to have a method that didn't ignore case, I could simply say something like this, list quote, and then I'd say find. And notice how it's giving me a set of auto expansions of things it knows how to generate automatically. So find by quote, and I could just say containing. And so you can see that this thing that I just generated, this is automatically generated code. I don't have to write the body of this code. This will go ahead and look up to see if the query is in the database, but it won't ignore a case. And I can also just say other things. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other stuff I could put in here. Find by quote in, and then I could say list of quote, list string, and call this queries. And what that will do is that will go ahead and take a list of queries and go see if they're perfect matches of that list of queries in the database by trying to match the quotes. So the nice part about this is you can have these methods generated for you automatically without having to write the query code itself, which is very, very, very powerful. OK, but we're just going to stick with find by quote containing ignore case. And then we're going to come back over here to the ZippyService. And you can see that there's a couple things it does. This is very straightforward. The getAllQuotes method just goes ahead and does a find all on the repository. the find all method comes out of the box from the JPA, and it just returns everything in the database. Here's the post quotes method. You can see it takes a list of integers, which are the quote IDs, and it calls the previously generated or automatically generated find all by ID method that's from the repository. That'll take each of these quote IDs and go ahead and find them in the database, and anything that matches the quote ID will get returned as the list of results. Again, we don't have to write the query, it's written for us. And then here's the one that we actually have to write, and you can see what we do here is we take this list of queries and the Boolean flag, and we use the Boolean flag together with the stream support.stream factory method. So stream support.stream takes the splitterator for the list of strings, and it says either run it in parallel or not. So it just kind of selects between the two. Let's say, for sake of argument, we do it in parallel. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and for each query in this stream of queries, we're going to call the find by quote containing ignore case method in the repository with the query. So we pass the query in. That's going to go find all the rows that match that particular query. And each of these things is going to return, find by quote containing ignore case is going to return a list of matching quotes, which we're then going to turn into a stream. And then we're going to use the flat map to flatten all these things. So each of these calls, for each query, we're going to get back a stream. So we're going to have a stream of streams as the result. And then we use flat map to flatten the stream of streams into a single stream of quotes, quote objects. And then we just convert that into a list. And that's what gets returned as the result of calling search. So that is super duper cool, right? Very interesting. Now, the one annoying thing about this, which we're going to work on and hopefully get working soon in another way, is we have to write this code manually to do this searching, where we want to be able to find everything that matches all the queries that contain the queries and ignore case. It would be nice if you could use the JPA to generate some query that said find by quote containing ignore case in. But there does not appear to be a way to automatically do that. So we have to drop back and use a query programming framework that's provided by the JPA in order to do that. And we're still working out the final details to get that working. But that's another way you'd really want to be able to do this. And so we'll probably show how to do that in a subsequent lecture and certainly in a subsequent assignment. So the other thing I just want to point out is over here, if you take a look at the Zippy resources, you'll see that Zippy has the data. So these are all the Zippy the pinhead quotes, which are rather odd and funny. Once again, we have an ID followed by the quote. That's the quote table that we're creating here and populating with all this stuff. And over here, we define the quote schema. And so you can see that the quote schema is a table, and it has an int that's generated by default as the identity, is the way with the key, basically. And then we have a very large character array, and we say that the ID is the primary key into the table. So that's just a way of declaratively programming JPA and Spring to know how to create that table on demand. And then over here, if you take a look at the application YAML file, you'll see that for the Zippy microservice, we tell it where to find the location, the data information. So we're going to say, go find the data in the Zippy data SQL file, and go find the schema in the Zippy schema.sql file. And so at startup time, Spring is smart enough to read this and use it to initialize the way in which that microservice works. So again, very, very, very powerful combination of declarative specifications in YAML files, declarative specifications here for things like the quote repository, so we don't have to do very much programming, and then our ZippyService largely either forwards to the repository or does a little bit of extra work to be able to query for each of the queries by looking things up in the repository. If we didn't have this particular mechanism, if we didn't have to do it like that, we could probably get by without using a service at all and just have the controller forward directly to the repository methods. but because we had this extra stuff here, we did it that way.